Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome friends and family and the contingent from Cole Harbour as well. Thank you. This research project, as Dr. Wilhock said, investigates the phenomenon of clergy stress. It seeks to understand the experiences of stress for clergy today. My social partner for this presentation is the artist James Tissot, a prolific 19th century French painter who was as interested as I am in how the prophets, teachers, and leaders of the church go about God's work. Here, for example, we have Mary Magdalene discerning her call prior to her conversion. All the images of Tissot's painting are in the public domain and were accessed at wikiart.org. I have long been drawn to Jesus' habit of retreating after worship and teaching. The most comforting example that comes to mind after I preach is from the Gospel of Mark. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. Although immersed in God's mission, Jesus rested well and often. He rejuvenated himself alone in communion with the Holy Spirit. I have noticed that as clergy, we often feel invited into God's mission and work, but not into her rest. I became interested in the topic of clergy stress for a number of reasons. As my own ministry education has progressed, I noticed with delight that congregations routinely become excited about new projects, and they begin working on new ways of answering God's call in the world. But as a former member of the staffing industry, I noticed with a bit of dread that the relationship between mission and personnel hours was rarely considered. And I wonder where the time comes from for ministers to support these new ministry initiatives in their congregations. And I've been troubled by this. I also noticed a nuanced move in the literature from ideas of clergy stress and burnout to an ethic of wellness. These ideas of self-care are by nature the sole responsibility of the clergy person. This assumes that outside factors contributing to clergy stress can be overcome by, for example, a healthy diet, exercise, improved communication skills, friendships, and effective time management. I have felt uncomfortable about this. And finally, I have felt called through this project to speak into this space where I observe, as I'm sure you do, the stress experienced by clergy today. Over the last few years pursuing my theological education, I have been beginning to become a minister. And what I observe around me is a curious mix of suffering and resilience. So this is my story, which will now be set aside in order to, as much as possible, hear from history, literature, and most of all my participants as to their experience of clergy stress. A phenomenological approach is taken up in this qualitative research project. We seek to understand the essence of experience, to examine how individuals in society make meaning of their everyday lives. In this study, I followed Clark Moustakas' method in his seminal text, Phenomenological Research Methods. It is a way to analyze everyday talk, rather than any concrete or qualified measures of the experience. In this way, I want to strip away the theoretical and scientific conceptions common to other forms of research and focus on the subject's own description of the phenomenon. The miraculous drought of fishes is like that. A story told to us by Jesus, a first-person account, is necessary to make meaning. This project seeks to make meaning of clergy stress through people's stories of stressful events in their ministry. The research question then is, where do you experience stress in your ministry? I sought to hear from the participants the causes of their self-professed experiences of stress. I wanted to know at what times did they feel like Daniel in the lion's den. The semi-structured interviews were about 45 minutes long and were designed to be attentive to other aspects of stress as well, namely coping strategies and stress's relationship to self-care. Data was collected through one-on-one interviews with 6 participants. It was initially thought that all the interviews would be conducted in a neutral location. However, they were conducted at locations convenient and comfortable to the participants, often in their own offices. Of the 6 participants, 4 were women, and 2 were men. They were all full-time ordained ministers in the United Church of Canada, with a range of 10 to 30 years experience. Each participant is in or has been in a congregational relationship exceeding 7 years. And all the participants self-identified as experiencing stress in their professional life as ministers. Of the participants, I have categorized 3 as currently serving suburban congregations, 2 are in urban settings, and 1 is in a multi-point rural pastoral charge. Having said that, each of the participants shared a range of experiences across their career, and each expressed comparisons to other ministry experiences with differing demographics. And now I would like to introduce you to my participants, who have been given the names of biblical characters who mirrored, in some small way, their own way of being in their work. Sarah, mother of the people, prophetic voice. Sarah says that everyone needs a certain amount of stress. It's when it moves into distress that it becomes difficult. Hagar, faithful, loyal, humble. Hagar tells us that stress in ministry is everyone having their own priorities for the minister. Rebecca, who has a kind heart and godly character, worries that the work will never get done. And Deborah, a prophet and a judge, says clergy stress is like the whole frog in the pot of water thing. It just heated up. It happened so gradually I didn't realize it. Jael, a courageous warrior, points to the decline of the mainline church and credits the pervasive negativity of both clergy and lay leadership as a contributing factor in stress. And Rachel, a good traveler and a hard worker, who attributes stress in part to our forgetting that the very essence of what the church is about is relationships, and they're hard. My research participants spoke in detail about their ministry and the areas that cause them stress. Many of their experiences were reminiscent of the extensive research conducted on clergy stress in the last 40 years. Irvin, in 1997, for example, provided a seemingly exhaustive list of stressors that impact clergy persons, and it's still a valid list today. His research suggests we are affected by identity issues, authority dynamics, success issues, perfectionism, sexuality, guilt, and theological issues. As most clergy can attest, vocational demands, family issues, colleague dynamics, relational dynamics, societal pressures, and a lack of personal space are also causal. What has been particularly helpful to the current research is Irvin's categorization of stressors. He describes all of these constructs as residing internally or externally. For Irvin and many others, the stressors we experience either arise from our nature and personality, which we in turn put into the world, or they reside outside of ourselves and press in upon us. In keeping with Irvin's list, I conducted a preliminary grouping of the data for my interviews in this way. I found that my participants indeed expressed examples of stressful experiences in some, if not most, of these categories. And while 40 years of research is helpful in so many ways, its exhaustive nature actually overwhelms my capacity to understand the phenomenon of clergy stress in a Christian context. It overwhelms my ability to share with you and with clergy seeking some relief in a cohesive way. In other words, if we attempt to reduce stress from 12 different angles, many of which represent a secular ethic, I believe we will all become quite stressed with the effort to understand how to reduce stress. So, from my initial preliminary groupings of stressors into these external and internal categories, I began to look for common themes and cluster the textual description of my participants' experiences accordingly. The emerging themes among the expressed stressors clustered into just two areas and one outlier: time. One way or another, regardless of the stressor being described, a common textual theme was time. Not enough time, the allocation of time to tasks, and effective time management. And the second is relationships. How people are with one another and the resultant feelings experienced by clergy is the other significant theme among a variety of stressors. And the outlier was stress caused by issue of financial instability. 3 participants spoke of financial stress, and of those 2 were speaking about congregations in serious financial difficulty. So time. The miracle of the loaves and fishes when Jesus retreated to find solitude and communion with the Holy Spirit following John the Baptist's death. The crowds followed him, and when he emerged from the boat near Bethsaida, they were waiting for him. He healed the sick and fed the hungry, turning, as we know, 5 loaves and 2 fishes into enough food for 5,000. Where did Jesus find the time? How did this miracle, this heaven-sent potluck, take? Jesus and the apostles, 13, passing food hand to hand to 5,000. The temporal nature of God's actions are not found in human understanding. These stories, these miracle stories, transcend human time and exist in God's eternity, that which we cannot understand. 3 participants talked about time in the first sentence of their interview, 1 in the 3rd sentence, and 1 spoke of all the details first and didn't mention time until the 6th sentence. 5 participants out of 6 spoke of time as the biggest stressor in their ministry. The participants' stories about time were occasionally quite wistful, as if they were seeking to participate with Jesus in God's eternity, time without end, rather than the paltry 40 hours allocated to them for ministry. Rebecca says, the places I experience the most profound stress is around getting everything done. The list. I carry these things on me the entire time I'm not getting them done. I can't get everything done. Time management is part of the stress. The sense of what I've not gotten done by the end of the week causes me a great deal of stress. Rebecca has self-identified an internal stressor. She clearly speaks about this here and in further dialogue, that for her, time and there never being enough of it relates entirely to her own incapacity to manage it. Perhaps if you remember Irvin's list, we can relate this to Rebecca's having success issues, or maybe identify her as suffering from perfectionism or maybe guilt. I'm not sure, though, that that's true or helpful. Rebecca's responses vary depending on the level of panic she's experiencing. She carries stress in her shoulders and stomach mostly. Deborah says, I have my regular job as the minister of a pastoral-sized church. And then the new ministry happened, which was another half-time job on top of that. So there was all this work and all this anxiety and a spiraling out of responsibilities. So I mean layers and layers of stress. Deborah has self-identified an external stressor, a full-time job and a part-time job. Her description speaks clearly about time. Irvin's list would place this issue clearly as vocational demands. And, like Rebecca, Deborah is experiencing stress related to time and our human capacity in and out of it. Deborah doesn't sleep when the stress takes over. She doesn't eat. She doesn't take time off and has difficulty making decisions. She dithers. The doctor said it was reactive depression, whereby her ministry context was the cause of her symptoms. JL speaks too about workload, saying, so all that provided me with the equivalent of a work week on top of a work week. JL responds to stress by putting on weight. And Sarah, distress is when there isn't enough time and her sleep patterns become disturbed. JL and Sarah, like Deborah, externalize ideas of there not being enough time to do all the things they are expected to do, and may be categorized as vocational demands as well, or if perceived another way in Irvin's list, they may be characterized as experiencing societal pressures. Hagar describes her main stressor like this. The key area of stress is having an unfocused job description where everybody thinks they know what your job should be, what your priorities should be, and I've never been able to get a job description. I was in the staffing industry. Hagar is describing the challenges of determining how to spend her time within defined parameters. So this is certainly a vocational issue, and perhaps could be described as a stressor related to colleague dynamics or relational dynamics. Hagar's issue, though, is that her time is not defined administratively. This produces for Hagar a sense of doom. She wakes up at 5 a.m., she's impatient, and doesn't give enough time to her primary relationship. As we gaze upon Tissot's expression of God's eternal time in creation, we can think about all the ways we struggle with human time in ministry. Whether internalized as an inability to manage time well, or externalized in recognizing there just isn't enough of it, or not being sure how exactly the congregation expects you to spend it, all the participants spoke of time as a significant stressor in their ministry, and they felt this stress most keenly around their funeral and pastoral care work. The inability to predict needs and allocate time, and the often, and this was the key, the often underrepresentation by lay leadership of the time required for this work was expressed. The second textual theme to emerge in the interview was clergy relationships with congregation members, and in particular with the lay leaders of the church. We see here Tissot's representation of the primacy of St. Peter, Jesus' chosen leader of the emerging Christian church. As chosen leaders of their churches, the participants described very different experiences. Two participants, one with 10 years and one with more than 20 years in the same community, expressed a confident resilience in their capacity to ameliorate difficult relationships. One with about 10 years of experience in the congregation had kind of a philosophical resignation, both towards people's bad behavior and also towards the stress it produced, which at times was significant. Two participants, one with 10 years and one with 7 years in the same church, described experiences that were bullying at best and abusive at worst. Jael and Sarah enjoy, for the most part, good relations with their congregations, although they both acknowledge that stressful relations do exist from time to time. Jael credits trust and says you can really manage a lot of stress when you can count on the people around you, when they are praising you instead of criticizing you. Jael's antidote to stress is nature and a daily spiritual practice. Sarah also speaks of trust. She says, "What causes me the most stress is when I have a sense that relationships are somehow being devalued, that somehow my personal integrity, my personal values are being questioned. This doesn't happen often. We have developed a lot of trust for one another here." Sarah experiences relief from stress by running away to the cottage or the spa. Jael and Sarah's resilience in the face of relational difficulties was grounded in strong spiritual beliefs. Their narratives were regularly punctuated with examples from Scripture, hymns, and spiritual practices. Both, interestingly, also credit preaching activities as stress relievers. Irvin's list places Jael and Sarah in the relational dynamics category of external stressors. He suggests that the kind of spiritual nurturance they engage in to be causal in their managing stress. Psalm 46 says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear." I felt this strongly in listening to Jael and Sarah. Rachel identified relational stress in the first sentence of the interview and returned to it again and again. Rachel says, stress is all kinds of places, but a lot of it has to do with people. Just because it's a church doesn't mean people aren't behaving badly. We forget that the very essence of what church is all about is relationships. Relationships with God and relationships among people. Right now, there are people who are not talking to me. Rachel's priority in ministry is the transformation of souls. And I sensed considerable sadness that people behaving badly has a significant impact. Rachel finds it difficult. Rachel feels relieved of stress by doing something fun, by reflecting on the accomplishments of the year, and by practicing detached concern with congregation members. Deborah and Hagar are under attack by leaders in their congregation and are no longer able to function normally. Deborah tells us, "I was dealing with an abusive person, and the whole community was actually quite terrified of this person in their own way." Deborah's antidote to this stress was to leave her congregation, because self-care means being in an environment where a whole day off a week is possible. And Hagar says, "They have a history of excluding their ministers from decision-making, so nothing I said had any weight. 3 Sundays in a row, I came home and cried." Hagar's antidote to stress was also to leave her congregation because she needed a ministry setting where she understood what was expected of her, and she could undertake aspects of ministry that she valued, like adult education. Lloyd Rediger in 1997 wrote his book, Clergy Killers. He suggests that unhealthy congregations exist, and at times, there is nothing a clergy person can do themselves to manage this stress. This is referred to as wounded pastor syndrome. Rediger suggests that the decommissioning of sin toward ideas of mental illness and human failure lead ministers and lay leaders who want to support them powerless to censure and control congregants who are abusive. In other words, lay people who abuse clergy are mentally ill and remain unchallenged by others in the congregation. The Center for Spirituality at Duke University, in their 2009 study of toxic churches and the health effects on clergy in these environments, revealed that No set of characteristics of a toxic church are universal, but two meanings do emerge with great consistency. The first is a collective and cumulative effect of multiple stressors when they intrude upon the relationship between the clergy person and the congregation. It results in dissatisfaction for both parties, and very often health consequences for the clergy person. The second common meaning that emerged is when the church has lost its focus from its traditional foundations. When the church has taken up the business and marketing model in which doing is more important than being. The authors conclude that these situations most often arise when worship for the glorification of God and education to nurture spiritual formation and health among congregation members is absent. This is Tissot's Barabbas, the most notorious prisoner, who was set free by Pilate instead of Jesus at the urging of Jesus' own people. In Matthew's Gospel, Pilate said to them, Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? All of them said, Let him be crucified. Then he asked, Why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, Let him be crucified. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself. Jesus was sacrificed by his kin, and Rachel, Deborah, and Hagar are, in some ways, being sacrificed by their congregations, who, like Pilate, are washing their hands of it. So where to from here with this pain and this curious mix of suffering and resilience, at times in one body? As Jesus unrolls the book in the synagogue, we could unroll the research and conclude that denominations should take measures to support clergy better, offer them training courses on how to manage their time and people with difficult personalities. We could conclude with the research and insist the church train lay people to be better human resource managers and somehow nicer to their ministers. We could criticize the research for relying too heavily on self-care ideas for clergy wellness, as this research does not bear that out. We could reiterate, as the literature does, that theological schools need to prepare their students in the art of coping with bad behavior by those in their congregations. We could rewrap the ideas of a resilient nature and somehow consider those who struggle in abusive congregations as less than, in some way, for not being able to overcome that which, according to Rediger, cannot be overcome. We can and do try to do all of these things. And I think we need to look at things quite differently than the 40 years worth of literature suggests. Does anybody know what this painting is? Yeah. It's Tissot's Crucifixion from the Cross. When gazing at this painting, I realized that the research, and each of us, mostly, gaze up at Jesus on the cross, seeking ourselves there, seeking to bend to our will that which we think should be. Turning this picture to Tissot's view infuses the discussion with hope and with humility. As Christ gazes down on us, he sees Christian leaders, whether lay or ordered, suffering deeply. I would suggest we are suffering from what Henry Nouwen calls the temptation to be relevant. As Christ gazes down upon us, consider moving. As Nouwen suggests in Reflections on Christian Leadership, consider moving from relevance to prayer, from popularity to ministry, and from leading to being led. Amen.
your very important research and great presentation.
Thanks.
Now we have about 20 minutes for question and answers. So who would like to start us off?
Excuse me.
Lesley, I'm curious if any of the respondents had access to their EAP program, and if that was no help.
I don't know. That never came up in our conversations. It was an open-ended interview, and so that might be telling, actually, that out of 6 participants, it never came up. Yeah, thank you for that, actually.
So remind me of the name of the researcher who listed all the stressors?
Irvin.
Irvin. So I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. When you were talking about Sarah and Jael and their relationship stressors, did you say that their response to the stress, Eisner would say, was contributing to their stress? Did I hear you properly there?
No, the opposite.
Oh, okay.
Their resilience, their sense of resilience, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I misheard you.
Yeah.
Another question I had, though, which will be quick, is in your reading, and I know it was your interviews with Clergy, but in your reading, did you get a sense of how much lay people understand the stress of clergy?
That's a really good question. I exclusively interviewed ministers of Word, Sacrament, and Pastoral Care in the United Church. And our structure is a volunteer structure. So I wouldn't say that the folks in ministerial oversight roles have professional training in that. It would be quite unusual for that to be the case. So the participants would say that pastoral care teams, so 4 out of 6 of the participants said that their pastoral care teams, or their pastoral oversight teams, didn't know what they were doing, like flat out, did not have the skills required to manage clergy or staff, but that the volunteers do the best they can. Excuse me.
I'm wondering, Lesley, in your study, if you discovered anything about the differences between rural and urban ministry yes.
Yeah, anecdotally, one of the participants several of the participants have been in both rural and urban or suburban pastoral charges. And the sense that I got is that in rural settings, the minister has a role in the community, and that a lot of well-being comes from this. So they are seen as someone who comes and prays at events. They're seen as someone who is welcome in the tragedy of a car accident or a family in need in the general community. Whereas in suburban/rural environments, the sense would be that clergy are one more thing to be managed in the system. And that seems to be impactful for people, for sure.
I saw a hand over here. Lesley, I'm actually wondering if in your earlier response you meant that ministry and personnel committees were incapable
Yes,
of.
sorry.
So, and conversely, I'm wondering if any of your participants had pastoral care teams who were actually sharing some of the responsibility of pastoral care and therefore alleviating some of the time constraints and the ability to respond with funerals and other things that do exacerbate clergy stress, and whether that may have come out as something helpful.
Pastoral care, I would say, is the most stressful construct, per se. It's all about time, but pastoral care is the language of stress for ministers. So it centers around time, confidentiality issues. So some clergy people have pastoral care teams that they work with who have a covenant of confidentiality. And therefore, there's a group of people in the community who understand the work that's being done. Others work more alone and see it as a very confidential practice. And therefore, the folks who lead them in the congregation don't know who they're visiting or how often or how much time they're spending at it. So pastoral care is, the other really big issue about pastoral care is the amount of time allocated in job descriptions versus the actual amount of time that a congregation wants you to engage in that activity is vastly different for every single participant. So your job description says 5 hours a week, but the list has 40 people on it and they want you to see 20 this week, and your charge has a geographic location of a 2-hour drive, right? So when you list the priorities, congregations with the folks that I interviewed, pastoral care is very important, but education comes first, or the things above the list, and they express that that's absolutely not true. And it causes a great deal of friction.
My question had to do with your conclusion. You listed 3 things at the end. I wonder if I could sort of flesh that out a bit.
Well, I think my mind always attempts to remain in a Christian ethic. I think our work is better that way, and I think our way of being in the world is better that way. And I think our rush to find solutions to some of the problems for clergy lends itself more to a business model, an ethic that says, these are the lists of tasks that you have to do, and this is the time you have to do them. And I don't think ministry works that way. And I think Nouwen's sort of ethic of humility and service, not to say that that's our only role to be servants, but his ethic of humility suggests that if we walk a little bit differently, we could probably relieve stress for each other. And if we change ourselves, if we each in this room went into the next ministry meeting with an attitude of humility versus the list of what you do or don't think the minister did, we could change things now, right? And then we can read all those reports about what the church is going to do for us when we have time, right? But we could change ourselves now through making very simple changes in how we perceive ourselves and others in the congregation. I mean, if your congregation has 3 funerals next week, one of you go in there on Tuesday morning and offer to answer the phones. Just do it and read the study while you're doing that, right? And your relationships will be transformed. And I think in anything of Henry Nouwen's that I read, that's the ethic. Like, take a step of some kind. You don't need the research to do that, I think. Sorry. Oh, stay away from that speaker.
Thanks, Lesley. I was really glad that your participant called jail did not have a stress response like the biblical jail.
Well, I don't know.
Although homicide is off and off. I'm curious about what I call the theological anthropology to which this points. And particularly, I would ask, is there a way in which stress is good for the creature? God makes us in God's own image. Is there some way in which we might think of stress as not only utterly evil, but also, in fact, in some sense, part of what helps the creature thrive?
Yeah, I was very resistant to, because it's a phenomenological study, to define the word stress. And several participants, particularly Sarah, was very clear that stress is something that we need in our bodies. It's our fright response. It's Psychology 101, which was too many years ago to recite. But when it becomes distress, would be these examples. The theological foundations, sadly the half an hour didn't allow for that, but I've traced the theological perceptions or the theological meanings of what a clergy person does. I traced from the Bible through to the Reformation. And the reality is it was the Reformation that brought pastoral care and created the job in this sort of huge vortex. Prior to that, if we look at the pastoral letters, prior to that, the job was to preach and to kick out demons and to know your Bible, right? That's all, that's what the job was. That's what the job was. And now it's a lot more than that.
Hi, Lesley. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. My question is about the people side of it. I know that stress and the literature around stress actually touches many more than the clergy. It particularly touches the caring professions. Clergy's obviously in that. And in my reading, I noticed that one of the words that you haven't used or phrases is burnout. And often the participant will say they're burnt out because they can't care. Right? The time and the relationship blockages interfere with the thing that brought them there in the first place. So I'm just wondering if any of that sort of came in stories.
There's a tremendous amount of literature that names the word burnout. I felt really called to follow the method of phenomenological research, which insists on the language within the interview. And I was quite surprised by lots of the language in the various interviews, and the word burnout was never used, even by the two folks who left their congregation for reasons of stress, who we would all agree, if we defined burnout as per secular and religious work on stress, it's all over the literature. It's not in the mouths of my participants.
This is something you sort of touched on it, or glazed over it in certain parts, and your character Hagar spoke about it a little bit. But I'm wondering around expectations. We've talked about expectations, but my question is around whose expectations are causing these stressors, and who's best able to manage those expectations in these scenarios?
You know, it's very convoluted, because these lists that Irvin adopts and many other researchers adopt on behalf of the church, they come from the secular work on stress and burnout. And so when Hagar talks about not being able to get a job description and all these things, it could fit into a variety of categories. Sure, it's related to her work, but does she have issues about getting along with people, which results in poor communication when you sit down to define tasks? I mean, you could list 10 things potentially that could result in not feeling like you have a job description, right? But that's not helpful, right? I mean, if we want to be helpful, that her story is not a one-off, right? So relationships between these parties are troubled. Are they troubled from a skill perspective? Who designs the job description? I read one last week, and my paper will include a lot of work on those technical pieces. And so I've been perusing job descriptions, and they're very secular in nature, right? You know, one of my participants said, a funeral takes 20 hours if you're going to do it right. If you were in any other profession and your boss walked in on Monday morning and said, by Friday, this 20-hour project needs to be done, there's very few people without support and help from other people that they'd laugh, right? So, I forget your question. Oh, the job descriptions. Yeah.
Well, I guess it was more around whose expectations
exactly
are we dealing with here? Because there are personal expectations that we place upon ourselves, and then there's the external expectations that other people thrust upon us as leaders in the church.
And that's why I categorized some of them in 3 or 4 different categories, depending on your nature and the people's nature you're dealing with. It could be a variety of things. But I'll tell you, these job descriptions that we produce in the church are really troubling. I looked at one last week that'll be published this week, and the number 2, the second most important thing for this congregation is Christian education. So one section lists what's important to us, and then down here it takes the time allocated for this person we're going to hire. 2 hours a week. It's a pastoral-sized church, right? What's that going to do, right? So these things either need professional support for development, clergy need a more cohesive voice to be able to speak into these things. I don't know. Yeah.
Well done, Lesley. Woo. So just a question, in your research, did you find anything to say or to question whether ordination itself, as kind of a setting apart from the rest of the congregation, somehow sets up an isolation that could maybe contribute to this level of toxic stress?
Yeah, when you read the literature about how ministry changed through the Reformation is really fascinating. It talks about, and I see evidence of this today, even though that's a long time ago, it sets up this unique class of human being, right? So it's, at the Reformation, it's poverty level pay, right? It's a very, it attracted, for the most part, post-Reformation, poor people. The level of education required is up here, right? So it creates this weird, separate class of human beings. And there's fascinating literature on that out of the Reformation. Yeah, so it is an isolating class that doesn't really have peers anywhere. And I think that's probably still relevant today. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
Great. Thank you.